So this is a explanation video on more of Sloterdijk's work. This is his interpretation of genealogy of morals, Nietzsche's famous work. It's his kind of view on what it is, what Nietzsche's trying to set out and do in that book, and this is all from Sloterdijk's work, You Must Change Your Life, which is basically a book about asceticism. So, asceticism, basically commonly referred to, not a very frequently used word today. Actually, I don't really know anyone who uses it other than myself. Really, and a few like weird, philosophers and stuff. But asceticism is, refraining from, gratification, pleasure, and so on. It's typically associated with, an old monk or something living in a monastery on an island or on a hill or something like this, right? It's this kind of typical kind of like modern kind of dismissal of this as something that only happened in the past or only happens with strange religious sects. We'll get into that later on afterwards. I think that's increasingly, and why I'm kind of doing a video on this, and I think this is not true anymore. I think asceticism is making a huge comeback, and it's important that when it does make a comeback, um, that we're able to kind of distinguish things from it, right? And I think this is exactly Sloterdijk's point, was that the genealogy of morals by Nietzsche was um, a science of asceticism. It was an attempt to do a kind of basically Sloterdijk argues that Nietzsche's work on asceticism is basically he traces ascetics to be the way in which moral forms of life and cultures are formed. Morality is in a sense physiological. It's in a sense psychological. It's in habits. It's in, I would say, also rituals. And this is what Sloterdijk refers to as the despiritualization of asceticism. So it's no longer something that is merely caught up in metaphysics or deep theological stories or something. It's something which has clearly exists even in a secular world, and this is kind of one of the points of why on earth was Nietzsche complaining about Christian influence on society in the late 19th century. I mean, like, science, enlightened, secular, scientific advancements were already completely in charge. I mean, by that point, Christianity was, as a kind of political order, was dead. It's the moral order which remained, and which is why Nietzsche was so fascinated by it. So basically you have this separation of morality from rigid religious structures and institutions. It's in habits, it's in values, it's in practice, and this also comes about. Part of Sloterdijk's book, You Must Change Your Life, is basically about how we need to shift, I think, away from thinking about the work life to the practicing life. We are Religiosity is not confined to a certain historical period, and it's not confined to a certain religious institution. We don't need to be inside a church to be religious, right? This is the point of seeing morality as an offshoot of asceticism, or intertwined with it, just deeply intertwined with it. So basically, asceticism, Nietzsche divides asceticism into two, right? You got, as written here, asceticism of the strong and asceticism of the weak. Now, preface, as we're using language which will, churn the stomach of any modern liberal, because, oh my god, how can you use words like weak and strong? This is how awful. How can you? And then we're later going to talk about, we're going to talk about the sick making the strong sick and weak and so on. And this is all going to trigger a lot of people, right? But just a preface on this is that Sloterdijk is someone who's written about basically rules for human zoo. I'd recommend it. Look it up. It's an essay. It's a very controversial essay. It's where he talks about Nietzsche. And he talks about eugenics and the Nazis basically. And his point is basically that Nietzsche's project was never one of eugenics. Nietzsche's project was always one of asceticism. It was always one of a much slower and much more fundamental kind of mastering of a people or mastering of a self, which can't be cheaply done and reduced to eugenicist programs. So you're not going to make the master race, or you're not going to be a master by taking a pill or by conducting any sort of modern scientific, eugenicist medical experimentation. It's something that he said Nietzsche would have thought that it would have taken multiple generations. That if you really wanted to bring modern people and culture back to basically the point I think Nietzsche would have argued was at its best would probably be antiquity. This would take multiple generations of rigid practicing programs and rigid kind of human cultivation on a much more fundamental sense, and there's no cheap, quick scientific fix for this. So eugenics is out the window for this conversation and for Sloterdijk in general. So just in case anyone's out there who's like a liberal and was like, oh my god, I can't believe you use it, we're gonna need to learn. Right, things are happening in the world as well. I'll talk about this in a different video, but we're gonna need to stomach this kind of language again because things are happening in the world where we can no longer, I think, avoid it, and we're gonna do more damage by avoiding it. So anyway, that preface at the window. So Nietzsche's distinction between asceticism and the strong asceticism. Right. I'll read Sloterdijk's. It's a few paragraphs, about a page, of what Nietzsche was doing and what this distinction is, and then I'll talk about it more. Right. So all right. So Nietzsche. Now this is he's referring here to Nietzsche's founding of what he calls Ascetology, the science of asceticism. Nietzsche not only stumbles upon the fundamental meaning of the practicing life for the development of styles of existence or cultures. He puts his finger on what he sees as the decisive separation for all moralities, namely into asceticisms of the healthy and those of the sick. Though he does not show any reservations about presenting the antithesis with an almost caricatural harshness, the healthy, a word that has long been subjected to countless deconstructions, are those who, because they are healthy, want to grow through good asceticisms, and the sick are those who, because they are sick, plot revenge with bad asceticisms. This can only be called the hair-raising simplification of the situation. Nonetheless, one has to admit, hammering home these arguments does bring something to light that must be acknowledged as one of the greatest discoveries of intellectual history. Nietzsche is no more or less than the Schliemann. I'm not entirely sure he's referring to there, but anyway, Schliemann of asceticisms in the midst of the excavation sites surrounded by the psychopathic rubble of millennia and the ruins of morbid palaces. He was completely right to assume the triumphant expression of a discoverer. We know today that he had dug in the right place. What he dug up, however, to continue the metaphor, was not Homer's Troy, but a later layer, and a large number of the asceticisms to which he referred polemically were precisely not expressions of life denial, and metaphysical servility. It was rather a matter of heroism in a spiritual disguise. Nietzsche's occasional misinterpretations cannot detract from the value of his discovery. With its find, Nietzsche stands fatally, in the best sense of the word, at the start of modern, non-spiritual ascetologies, along with their physio and psychotenetic annexes, with dietologies and self-referential trainings, and hence all the forms of self-referential practicing and working on one's own vital form that I bring together with the term Anthropotechnics. So this is kind of getting into Sloterdijk's idea of Anthropotechnics, which is basically, it can be summarized by that phrase, which I quite like. It's humans are born, but men are made. Humans are forced to enter into kind of symbolic worlds of practice, repetition, ritual, I would say as well, which are life forms which form the human, right? We're separated from animals in the sense of being in a kind of closed natural world where you seek, needs. Humans' needs are beyond material, they're beyond biological, they're symbolic, and they're spiritual in a very broad sense, not spiritual as in the traditionally theological sense, but spiritual in an extremely broad sense of how we deal with the symbolic and the ritualistic. And so what Sloterdijk is basically referring to there in his distinction is that Nietzsche concentrated most of his time criticizing priestly asceticisms. These are the asceticisms of the sick, and these are sort of the leftovers of the death of God. Once God died, you continue to get all sorts of moral values and habits and rituals which stem from, I think he would argue, from Christianity, but don't need the existence of this God, right, in order to be as real as before. I would even go as far as to say maybe it's even worse. It's a bit like Marx's critique of, capitalism, and being that, like, if you have a feudal lord, who the boss is. When you're under a contractual obligation to work, especially today with all the kind of managerial classes and stuff, we're not really sure who we're kind of alienated from that. From that kind of point of authority or point of belief. We're always searching for it. So in a sense, you can even argue that we're more today caught up into the spiritual than when God was, pre-death of God era. So, but so basically, as you can see with the slide, the asceticisms of the week are more or less an attempt to, of course, this all comes from Resentiment as well, so it stems from Resentiment, but it's an attempt, it comes from an obsession with their own sickness and their own suffering, and a desire to make others sick along with them, as opposed to and they're usually moralistic asceticisms. You must not do this, you must not do that, you must refrain from this, rather than being the asceticism of the strong, which I've also been referred to as instrumental asceticisms, as opposed to moral asceticisms. And these are the asceticisms which philosophers, warriors, athletes, artists might take. And they're I'm looking for the quote. He has a good quote, which also continues this. Yeah, whatever. I can't find it. But anyway, the here we are. I got it. Okay. Right. So just continue on this division between asceticisms. In his differentiation between asceticisms, Nietzsche posited a clear divide between the priestly varieties on one side, illuminated by his vicious gaze, and the disciplinary rules of intellectual workers, philosophers, artists, as well as exercises of warriors and athletes on the other side. If the former are concerned with what one might call pathological asceticism, as in the asceticism of the weak, an artful self-violation among an elite of sufferers that empowers them to lead other sufferers and induce the healthy to become co-sick. Very important. The latter only impose their regulations on themselves because they see themselves as a means of reaching their optimum, as they see the asceticisms as a means to reaching their optimum as thinkers and creators of works. Right. So, optimal kind of optimizing an end. Right. You can think of refraining from sexual activity before an athletic event. I think in like mixed martial arts and boxing and that kind of stuff, there's a general rule to refrain from sexual activity until after the competition. You might think of artists might what would they do? Like they might fast, they might take substances, although we would kind of argue that's an artificial kind of thing. As an artificial kind of mindset to be in. So maybe we wouldn't say that, but there's a hesitation and a disciplinary set of habits which are imposed on the self, which basically we could say almost like redirects some sort of energy towards a higher end or a higher goal. It could be philosophical, that could be artistic, that could be to do with athleticism and so on and so forth, right? I even believe Che Guevara referred to the revolutionary as an ascetic person, because of course his version of the revolutionary was very different to the modern version of the revolutionary, which is to sit around Twitter getting angry at people. It was, or working for big corporations and trying to impose self-awareness of sinfulness onto workers and so on. Che Guevara's asceticism was basically you lived in the wilderness. You walked around, the South American rural landscape, reading Marx and learning to use weapons or to navigate and so on. It was basically, I would actually argue the important thing about Che Guevara, the reason he's still so popular today, wasn't because he was a communist, was because he was advocating for an ascetic life, and he ran away from a very privileged life. He was, part of the kind of upper middle class, kind of in I think it was Argentina, and I think he was a trained doctor, and his parents were all very upper middle class doctors, and he had a very comfortable existence, and he just found it meaningless and horrible, and he ran away from it and became, ultimately died. But that's a good example of a kind of asceticism of the strong, an asceticism of overcoming, as opposed to the priestly asceticism. And I think just to so a few let's concentrate on contemporary examples, right? Contemporary examples of asceticism of the strong, I would argue, no fap, right? Like, you have this era, which is all these young men are just burdened with unlimited supply of pornographic imagery, and for a few decades it's just this is all fantastic, this is all great, and then eventually at some point everyone kind of goes, hold on a minute. Well, not everyone, certain people who are still labeled all sorts of strange moralistic terms for arguing for a kind of self-discipline again, away from something like pornography. I think there's an awareness that basically this holds people back. It stops them reaching. It stops them doing anything with their lives. It stops them actually obviously obtaining anything. And it's almost like a kind of form of of kind of imposed control. I mean, if everyone has kind of immediate access to pornographic imagery and everyone's so constantly so placated with this kind of vulgar, abstraction of eroticism. I think that there is an argument to be made of like, this is this is a kind of form of censorship somehow. It's a kind of censorship of the will. It disencourages and disallows, particularly I think young men to kind of redirect energy, especially on a kind of bodily level, towards a kind of higher purpose. This is the very much the product of being a last man. Being a last man means that there's nothing to redirect energy. There's no reason to discipline. There's no reason to overcome your. So you start seeking the most convenient and comfortable ways of life, and comfortable means of doing things. So no fap, cold shower. I've done this before, like cold swimming, because I grew up near the coast in Ireland, and see a lot of people do. People go swimming the whole year round in the ocean, and it's just like this strange thing they do, and I would argue that's kind of a form of asceticism. Wim Hof, of course, the Iceman who encourages this. I would say that's kind of a form of asceticism of the strong. Yeah, I'm sure there's loads more examples. So okay, I said asceticisms of the week, or pathological, or moralistic asceticism. What are these? These are a bit more elusive today, right? Because you might typically associate these with, priests, holding back from urges and so on, particularly sexual or maybe violent urges. Today, I would argue that if you look at COVID and the lockdown, you may be looking at, refrain from social interaction, refrain from too much excitement, putting masks on children and so on in schools. I think this is a very obviously. I mean, if you look into this, there's no scientific reason to do this. These are the kind of asceticism of the week. To kind of moralize about any sort of stimulation, any sort of what's the word? Any sort of inspiration, any sort of excitement whatsoever. And I think that it largely comes about because we have a generation of people, or maybe more than one generation of people, who are so undisciplined, who are so bombarded with convenience, pornography, distraction, titillation of all kinds, that suddenly, there's a complete loss of any discipline, loss of self-control, and I think that leads to a very prudish, moralistic, fear of any stimulation whatsoever. I mean, I'm always thinking of Zizek's example of beer with no alcohol, coffee with no caffeine, and so on. We're like, of course, alcohol in beer and caffeine in coffee are stimulants. They stimulate. We're terrified of them today, and I think this is because we have no self-control. Like we've completely reduced any sort of discipline or pain endurance or the ability to overcome. We've completely destroyed it. We've systematically destroyed it for a few generations. I would say since the baby boomers to now, we've just more and more destroyed it, and now people are nervous wrecks. I mean, if you look at the youth today, I mean, they've all got 151 fucking anxiety disorders, and they can't tolerate anything, and they can't go 10 minutes without staring at their phone, flicking through things. They're all terrified of what people think of them. That's why they spend all their time on social media. They're all watching each other and going, am I approvable? Please tell me I'm approvable. You kind of have this kind of complete mental and physical, and of course all the health and safety, right? I think actually health and safety regulations, right, are the asceticisms of the week today. They are the asceticisms of the week. They're all these moralistic, oh my God, if you allow this, if you do that, someone will get hurt, and we will be responsible for hurting people, and we'll be bad people, and all of this kind of this pretty neurotic obsession with health and safety, and protecting the vulnerable and so on. They generally just make everyone really scared, really nervous, really uncomfortable, really weak, really unable to grow, unable to overcome, unable to endure. As opposed to the asceticism of the strong, which, if anyone is listening to this, have ever taken up a martial art, for example, it's a kind of good example of something which remained in Western culture. It's actually become totally popular in the past like 20 years. It's just become insanely popular. Um, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it's not like we've reverted back to some martial culture. It's not like, the fascists or the communists took over, and these are military societies, and strength and honor and discipline suddenly come again. No, on one hand, we've become completely, Homo economicus, consumer last men, and all of a sudden you have this like, you have MMA gyms in every fucking city in the world, near, well, in the West at least. And I think because if you go to these do offer you a sense of like, okay, this isn't nice, this hurts, but it's towards something, it overcomes, and people just kind of liberate themselves from this total fragility, that they're encouraged. No, so I would, and interestingly, in France, MMA was banned. It was outlawed until a few years ago, right? So, what are you talking about is outlawed in France? France is a secular country. France is a secular, progressive, liberal country. How could this be outlawed? Well, it was. And I think this is why. It's because I think that something like the health and safety regulatory morality of, which we see completely taking over the world with COVID, is a really good example of it's not a desire to protect people. It's a desire to create a culture which holds people back, and and is run, I think, largely by the weak and the miserable, in order to make other people as weak and miserable, because it stops them overcoming and stops them growing. Which is why I think there's a specific there's a specific kind of like insistence on children, when even though we're going through a pandemic at the moment, which in which children are pretty invulnerable to the disease. There's an insistence that they almost, I mean, it's almost, I think you almost obsess over children wearing masks in school much more than you do middle-aged people walking around in public transportation. This makes no sense from a medical point of view, but it does make sense from an aesthetic point of view. So, yeah, I would say, this is so important because we need to start thinking about this division again, and how the antagonism between forms of asceticism, which are, as Sloterdijk points out, moral cultures. Well, like their moralities formed through habit and practice. Um, how this relates to our kind of moral contentions and our culture wars. I think our culture wars are very much bound into this as well.